This is not just the story of an actor's passing. It's the story of how a familiar face from television quietly reshaped how millions understood strength, vulnerability, and legacy, long before the public ever knew what he was facing. When Eric Dane revealed his ALS diagnosis, he didn't disappear. He didn't retreat from the spotlight. Instead, he chose to keep moving forward, on screen, in public life, and in purpose. And nearly a year later, at just 53 years old, his story came to a close. But the meaning of it didn't. What happened in those final months, and how his career, struggles, and choices connect, reveals a much bigger picture than fame alone. For many viewers, Eric Dane will always be remembered as Dr. Mark Sloan, confident, charismatic, and effortlessly magnetic. When he joined Grey's Anatomy in 2006, the reaction was immediate. What began as a short appearance quickly turned into a defining role. Publicly available accounts suggest that audience response reshaped his future on the show. Mark Sloan wasn't just another character, he became a cultural moment. But behind that success was a growing tension Dane himself would later acknowledge. While viewers embraced the image, Dane began questioning how much of his career was being shaped by perception rather than intention. In later interviews, he explained that leaning into the role felt almost unavoidable at the time. It worked, but it also narrowed expectations. And that conflict between what the audience wanted and what he wanted to explore would quietly follow him for years. Eric Dane was born in San Francisco in 1972. Long before red carpets and scripts, his childhood was shaped by an early and deeply impactful loss. His father died when Dane was just 7 years old. In later reflections, Dane described his father as complex, someone with talent, discipline, and inner struggles. Only after becoming a parent himself did Dane fully understand the weight of that absence. That perspective mattered, because acting wasn't part of a lifelong plan. By his own account, Dane discovered acting almost accidentally, through a high school production that replaced a shortened sports season. What began as a substitution quickly became something more. He has said that moment changed everything. After graduating, Dane moved to Los Angeles with very little money and no guarantees. The early years were unstable. He later acknowledged periods of partying, poor decisions, and uncertainty. Years that didn't resemble the polished image audiences would later see. But they shaped him. Slowly, guest roles followed, small appearances, recurring parts, a career built piece by piece, not overnight. When Grey's Anatomy elevated Dane to mainstream fame, the attention came fast and intensely. He was widely labeled a television sex symbol, something he later spoke about with nuance rather than resentment. In interviews, Dane explained that embracing that perception felt like an artistic responsibility at the time. Giving the audience what they responded to seemed like the simplest path forward. But simplicity has a cost. As the show progressed, Dane began feeling boxed in. He loved the character, but not the idea of playing versions of the same role forever. That internal conflict coincided with personal challenges that were becoming harder to manage privately. When his time on the show ended in 2012, the public narrative focused on the character's exit. Dane's own explanation, years later, added complexity. He shared that he was struggling personally at the time, and while he didn't believe that was the official reason for his departure, he understood why the network moved on. By his own words, he wasn't the same person they had originally hired. What followed was not a disappearance, but a recalibration. After leaving Grey's Anatomy, Dane continued working steadily. Films, television roles, and eventually a leading role on The Last Ship allowed him to step into a different kind of presence, more restrained, more authoritative, and less defined by appearance alone. Still, even that came with limitations. Dane later admitted he felt the character shared similarities with his earlier work, and that realization pushed him to search for something riskier, something less comfortable. That search led him to Euphoria. The role of Cal Jacobs was a deliberate departure, complex, morally fragile, and emotionally layered. Dane described the experience as freeing, explaining that the character required precision and empathy to avoid being misunderstood. It was a performance rooted not in charm, but in contradiction, and audiences noticed. What they didn't know at the time was that Dane was entering one of the most challenging chapters of his life. In 2025, Eric Dane made a decision that surprised many people in the industry. Instead of keeping his diagnosis private, he chose to speak openly about being diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, commonly known as ALS. According to publicly available information, he understood what that disclosure would mean, not just for his career, but for how the public would now interpret every appearance, every role, every moment. He didn't frame it as a goodbye. He didn't frame it as a tragedy. He framed it as reality. ALS is a progressive neurological condition, and Dane acknowledged that his future would look different. But what stood out was what he did not do. He didn't step away from life. He didn't ask to be defined by the diagnosis. Instead, he kept working. He stayed present, and he began using his visibility in a new way. According to statements from his family, Dane became increasingly focused on awareness and research, determined that his experience could contribute to something larger than himself. This shift didn't come with dramatic speeches or viral moments. It came quietly through consistency. And that choice set the tone for everything that followed. Long before his diagnosis, Dane had been open, carefully and responsibly, about parts of his life that many celebrities avoid discussing. He had spoken about depression. He had acknowledged addiction and recovery. He had reflected on public moments that were widely discussed, often without context. What made these reflections different was their lack of defensiveness. In interviews, Dane didn't attempt to rewrite the past. He didn't deny mistakes, nor did he dramatize them. He framed his experiences as exactly that. Experiences, parts of a life that shaped him, not labels that defined him. That perspective became even more significant after his ALS announcement, because now every past struggle was being viewed through a new lens. And rather than retreating, Dane continued to clarify who he was, not through statements, but through presence. He showed up as a father, as a husband, as an actor still, committed to his craft. And according to those close to him, those roles mattered more than any headline ever could. Eric Dane married actress Rebecca Gayheart in 2004, and together they welcomed 2 daughters, Billy and Georgia. Over the years, their relationship experienced public shifts, including a divorce filing in 2018. But life rarely follows a straight line. In March 2025, Gayheart filed to dismiss the divorce. Publicly available court records confirmed the change, but neither party turned it into a media moment. It wasn't presented as a statement. It wasn't explained away. It simply happened. And in the months that followed, Dane's family became the center of his world. In the most literal sense, according to the family's statement after his passing, he spent his final days surrounded by those closest to him. That detail matters, because when a life ends, what remains isn't the number of roles played or the attention received. It's who was there, and who mattered most. In the months after going public with his diagnosis, Dane didn't disappear from relevance. He also didn't seek constant visibility. Instead, his presence felt intentional. When he spoke, it was measured. When he appeared, it was purposeful. When he worked, it was with clarity. There was no attempt to create a farewell narrative, no framing of himself as inspirational in a forced way. If anything, Dane seemed focused on normalcy, on continuing life as fully as possible within changing limits. According to his family, that approach defined his final chapter. Strength, in this context, wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was steady. And that steadiness reshaped how many people viewed him, not just as an actor, but as a person navigating something deeply human. Eric Dane passed away on Thursday, February 19th, at the age of 53. The announcement didn't arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic revelations, no sensational framing. His family confirmed the news through a simple, carefully worded statement, noting that he passed following a courageous battle with ALS, and that his final days were spent surrounded by loved ones, his wife, close friends, and his 2 daughters, who they described as the center of his world. The tone of the statement mattered. It wasn't focused on loss alone. It wasn't focused on illness. It focused on presence. And almost immediately, that tone shaped how the news was received. Tributes from fans, colleagues, and industry figures reflected not just grief, but gratitude for the work, for the honesty, and for the way Dane chose to navigate the last chapter of his life. What stood out was how little speculation followed. The story didn't spiral. Instead, it settled. In the days following his passing, responses from across the entertainment world shared a common thread. They didn't reduce Eric Dane to a single role. They didn't define him by a diagnosis. They spoke about professionalism, about generosity on set, about someone who took the work seriously, even when the work was difficult. For many, this reframing felt important, because while audiences may have first known Dane as a symbol of confidence, of charm, of presence, the people who worked with him consistently described someone grounded, thoughtful, and deeply aware of his responsibilities as a storyteller. That distinction matters. It suggests that his impact wasn't limited to what appeared on screen, but extended into how he approached the craft itself, even as his personal circumstances became more complex. When you step back and look at Eric Dane's career as a whole, a pattern becomes clear. It wasn't about constant escalation. It wasn't about staying in one lane. It was about movement. From early guest roles to breakout success, from being typecast to actively resisting it, from mainstream appeal to morally complex characters, each phase reflected a willingness to change, even when change came with risk. And perhaps most importantly, his later work suggested a growing interest in depth over visibility. That evolution didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, sometimes unevenly, but in hindsight, it reads as intentional. A career shaped not just by opportunity, but by choice. Why his story resonates beyond entertainment. Eric Dane's story resonates because it intersects with something universal, not fame, not celebrity, but adaptation. He navigated loss early in life. He faced success that came with pressure. He acknowledged personal struggles without turning them into spectacle. And when confronted with a life-altering diagnosis, he chose transparency without surrendering dignity. That combination is rare, and it reframes how his final year is understood, not as a closing act, but as a continuation of values he had been building toward for decades. In the end, Eric Dane leaves behind more than a body of work. He leaves behind an example of how to remain present in uncertainty, how to keep creating without pretending, how to be seen without being consumed by the spotlight. His legacy isn't defined by how his story ended, but by how consistently he chose honesty along the way. And that raises a larger question. How many other stories do we misunderstand because we only look at the surface and not the full arc? That's the question explored in the next chapter. Because understanding a life means looking beyond the moment it's remembered and into the choices that shaped it.